Longhorn. I'm an English instructor here at Pulaski Technical College, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Big Rock Reading Series. We're excited to host Dr. Adam Long and Dr. Ruth Hawkins tonight, and they are here to talk to us about literature in the South, and particularly about Ernest Hemingway's time in Arkansas and his connection to the area, and especially how that influenced both his writing and the other writing going on at the time. I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you brought your winter coats. The AC is unadjustable, even though they taunt you with a thermostat right there. But you can push it as much as you want. If you don't have the magic computer to plug into it, you can't make it get warmer. So I apologize. Before we dive into things, if you all would take out your cell phones and put them on the mute setting. We also ask that audience members don't text during the event. I know it seems like a little thing that nobody can notice when you're doing it, but when you're speaking at a podium and you see the little flash of the blue light popping up around, it can be very distracting. So thank you for that. I need to acknowledge and thank the support we receive from our PTC administrators, our support staff, the English department faculty, and from our donors who are listed on the backs of your programs. This series is only possible through the generous support of the people and organizations listed on your program. And you'll find a donor form in your little packet. It would be the green form, because everybody knows that green stands for money. If you enjoyed tonight's performance and would like to help us bring more authors and scholars to speak at Pulaski Tech, you could consider donating either tonight, or there's an address on the form where you can mail in a donation. There's also a pink survey in there, and we collect that data so that we can apply for grants. Again, all in the interest of bringing good people here to talk to you all. Some of you may have a golden ticket in your program, so just hold on to that, and we will address that at the end of the evening. For those of you who are here for a 6 o'clock class, rest assured we'll be done in time for you to move on to your 7:25 class, so no need to panic. Tonight we have the great pleasure of hosting two scholars. After Dr. Long and Dr. Hawkins make their presentations, we will have time for a Q&A. Then, at the end of the event, Dr. Hawkins will be up at the front table being willing to sign her books, which are for sale for $35. We take cash, check, and credit card. One of the things I love about hosting this series is the chance to showcase writers who live here among us, right here in Central Arkansas. And both of our guests tonight are just that. Dr. Adam Long is the director of the Hemingway-Pfeiffer Museum and Educational Center in Piggott, Arkansas. Originally from Jonesboro, he has a PhD from the University of Kansas and degrees from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and Lyon College in Batesville. Dr. Long's scholarship focuses on 20th century American literature and in particular the changing South at the beginning of the 20th century. Though Ernest Hemingway is not from the South, he visited and wrote in Arkansas regularly, and the prominent Pfeiffer family of Piggott was one of his greatest influences. Through this Arkansas connection, Dr. Long explores the ways in which the Arkansas Delta and the South more generally was connected to a rapidly changing world in the 1920s and 1930s. Following his presentation, Dr. Ruth Hawkins will speak to us all. Dr. Hawkins holds a Bachelor of Journalism degree from the University of Missouri, a master's degree in political science from Arkansas State University, and a PhD in higher education administration from the University of Mississippi. She is now the executive director of Arkansas Heritage Sites at Arkansas State University, including the Hemingway-Pfeiffer Museum and Educational Center at Piggott, the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, I should have gotten the pronunciation of this, Tyranza, the Lakeport Plantation near Lake Village, the historic Dias Colony, boyhood home of Johnny Cash, and other preservation and heritage tourism projects throughout the Arkansas Delta. Her book, Unbelievable Happiness and Final Sorrow, tells the story of the marriage between Ernest Hemingway and Pauline Pfeiffer of Piggott, Arkansas, including the influence her family had on this great writer. First, would you help me welcome Dr. Adam Long?
guess this part. All right, thank you. I'll be talking tonight about how Ernest Hemingway came to write in Arkansas and his time here, giving a little bit of the background information about Hemingway in Arkansas. I've just this week discovered this new program to use instead of PowerPoint. So if you think it's a little bit much, I might have just been in a mood. So Ernest came to Arkansas through his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. We can see, look at that. All right, so Pauline Pfeiffer, she was born in Iowa in 1895. Her father and two of his brothers owned a pharmaceutical company there in Iowa. And then as she grew up, they moved to St. Louis, and she attended St. Louis. She attended high school in St. Louis at the Academy of the Visitation, and this is her there. The pharmaceutical company continued to grow. It would eventually relocate to Philadelphia and then ultimately to New York. But her father, Paul, he decided that he wanted to get into farming. For one thing, he didn't like the city. He had asthma and the smoke bothered him. So he started looking for a place to buy farms, a place where he could move to start a farming operation. He chose Piggott sort of by chance. He had been visiting New Orleans, and the main train line from New Orleans to St. Louis passes through Piggott. And on his way back, the St. Francis River, which crosses the tracks about 5 miles north of Piggott, flooded, leaving him stranded there in Piggott for about 3 days. He spent that time talking to some of the local people, walking around, looking at the land, and he discovered that there was a lot of good farmland that had been cleared by lumber companies and that was available to be improved for a very reasonable price. So that was 1902 that he ended up in Piggott, and that year he bought about 150 acres, and then by the time he was done, he owned 63,000 acres in Clay County in northeast Arkansas. 1913, July the 4th, 1913, he moved his family to this home on Cherry Street in Piggott. The home was already there. It was not built for the Pfeiffer family. It was built by one of the local master builders there, and it been built about 3 years before that. And they purchased it, and I've got some pictures in a minute of the inside if you want to sort of see what it looks like. So 1913 was the year that Pauline graduated from high school. So she graduated from high school in St. Louis in June, and then the family moved to Piggott in July. Okay, she went on to college at the University of Missouri at Columbia. She got a degree in journalism there and went on to a career in journalism. She had a few jobs in the United States after graduating, and then ultimately ended up with Vogue magazine in Paris. And this is her picture while at Vogue. And it was while living in Paris that she met Ernest Hemingway. Ernest had been injured in World War I and then had returned briefly to the United States and then had gotten a job with the Toronto Star as a foreign correspondent, and then eventually just lived in Paris as a freelance writer. Pauline and Ernest met at a party in 1925. Ernest was married at the time to a woman named Hadley Richardson, and they had one son together. And Hadley was also from St. Louis. Pauline and Hadley did not know each other, but they did have a mutual friend, and that mutual friend said, "Hey, you're from St. Louis. I know somebody from St. Louis. Y'all should meet. Maybe you know some of the same people." And they didn't, but they did become good friends. and so much so that Hadley started inviting Pauline to spend more time with the family, including inviting Pauline to join the Hemingways for a skiing trip to Schruns, Austria, over the Christmas holidays, 1925, and it was about that time that Pauline and Ernest began an affair that ultimately resulted in Ernest leaving Hadley and marrying Pauline. They were married in Paris on May the 10th, 1927. This is their wedding photo. They lived in Paris briefly and then returned to Key West, where they basically owned their family home for their marriage was there in Key West. During this time period, they would visit Piggott regularly. Basically, their schedule would be they would spend the winters in January, February, when the weather was pleasant in Key West. They would spend it there, and then later they would spend the warmer months out west, Montana, Wyoming, doing big game hunting where the weather was cooler. On the way out there, they would spend several months in Piggott, and then on the way back, they would spend the holidays in Piggott. So when they were in Piggott, they were frequently there for 2 or 3 months at a time, and then 2 or 3 months coming back. So this wasn't just a weekend stop at the in-laws and say, hey, they would live there for months at a time when they were there. The family converted the barn behind their house into a permanent studio for Ernest. Ernest had been writing in this barn the whole time he had been visiting there, and there was wrote there while it was still a barn. The Pfeiffers, they rented out farms. They didn't do farming themselves, so the barn was basically a storage building. It didn't have, livestock. It was basically a storage building, and it was in that state that Ernest wrote portions of A Farewell to Arms, and A Farewell to Arms was so successful that the family decided that if Ernest had a finished permanent studio there in Piggott, he could get more work done, and if he got more work done while he was there, he would come more often, bring the grandkids more often, that sort of thing. So they converted the barn into a permanent studio for him in 1932. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the current state of the property and what we do now. The museum today, it's operated by Arkansas State University out of Jonesboro. We have the restored home, and you can see, I mentioned earlier, the inside of the house. It has several sort of very unique features, such as the pressed tin ceilings that you see. We also have the restored barn studio, where Hemingway wrote. So one thing you can do at the museum is get a tour. We do tours 6 days a week. So you can drop in by yourself, you can bring groups, that sort of thing. So hopefully, if some of you are more interested to see this after tonight, hopefully you'll come and visit us in upcoming months. We also have special exhibits that focus on different aspects from time to time. This Into the Wild exhibit was opened a year ago, January, and it focuses on Ernest and Pauline's 1933-34 safari, which was financed by the Pfeiffer family and which became the subject of some of Ernest's most famous works, Green Hills of Africa, Snows of Kilimanjaro. So this is a permanent exhibit. If you come, you'll get to see that. We also have a temporary exhibit right now that we opened this summer to celebrate the 100th year anniversary of the Pfeiffer's arrival in Arkansas. July the 4th was their anniversary here, and so what we've done is focus on the prominence of the Pfeiffer family internationally, which is, I think, something that Ruth will probably touch on a little bit with Pauline's Uncle Gus as a major figure there. So we have special exhibits. We also do educational programming. I've got some, we do it for kids, partially, kids after-school writing groups, that sort of thing. We do an annual art exposition for high school students. And then for adults, we do 3 times a year we have writers' retreats where we bring in mentors. This is right there in black in the middle of the table is Joe McDougall, who's a member of the Arkansas Writers Hall of Fame. She joined us last November for our retreat. We've got one coming up in just a few weeks as well. Andrea Hollander, who's another Arkansas writer, will be joining us. Will be joining us there. So, if any of you are writers, you might want to keep that in mind. They're week-long. Two of them are week-longs. One's a weekend retreat, and we just spend bring in a mentor and spend all day working on writing of all different genres. So, with that, I will turn it over.
Well, thank you. And I did bring my cell phone up here, but I promise I won't text while I'm talking. I just kind of need to keep track of the time so that we allow plenty of time for questions. Well, I appreciate being here, and I think in the publicity for this event, it said something about the fact that it was not my intent to write a book. And that's really true, because when we started the restoration that Adam mentioned, about 15 years ago, we at Arkansas State University acquired the house and the barn studio and began restoring it. And obviously, to do a good job of restoring it, we needed to do the research on how the family used the house and the barn, how they lived in it, and so forth. And a couple of things struck me as we were doing the research. One of them was that there was really very little written about Pauline Pfeiffer. And what little was written was usually incorrect. And I attribute this to a number of factors. One is, and let me say that the reason this was so odd is that Pauline, even though he was married 4 times, eventually, Pauline was the wife who was married to him during the entire time that he was productive as a writer. She was also the mother of 2 of his 3 children. Yet, as I said, there was very little about her. And I attribute it to the fact that, for one thing, the Pfeiffers were very private people, and Pauline was very private. But also, she had the misfortune of dying 10 years before Ernest, whereas his other 3 wives had the good sense to outlive him, and they got to tell their story of what it was like living with Ernest their own way without Ernest's take on it. And so all 3 of his other wives have either written books or they had books written about them and about their life with Ernest Hemingway. But there was nothing on Pauline other than whatever Hemingway told people about Pauline. And usually after the divorce, what Hemingway told people wasn't always very pleasant. So that struck me as strange. The other thing that struck me in the research was just how influential the Pfeiffer family was. I maintain that without the Pfeiffer family, there would be no Ernest Hemingway. Or at least there would not be the body of work that we know today as Hemingway's work. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the Pfeiffers and how they influenced Ernest. And certainly Pauline was one of the biggest influences. Adam talked about how she began a friendship with Hadley and ultimately became close to Ernest. And one of the reasons that she became close to Ernest is because he recognized what a good editor she was. She had graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism. She wrote in that very short, crisp, journalistic style, which was the style that Ernest Hemingway used. And certainly from his background as a newspaper correspondent, he was used to that style. Pauline also subscribed to the Iceberg Theory, which is often attributed to Hemingway. which, if you're not familiar with that, he always believed that when you wrote something, you should leave just a little bit of it out of the water or above the surface, and most of the meaning or the depth of the story should be below the surface for the reader to discover for themselves. And so Pauline edited all of his work and critiqued it, made suggestions for changes, even before they were married, obviously, and again, spent so much time with working with him on his writing that he ultimately did divorce Hadley and marry Pauline. But then, even when he divorced Pauline, and eventually he did divorce Pauline because he met Martha Gellhorn, who was a war correspondent, and fell in love with Martha, and basically said Pauline got what she deserved because she took him away from his first wife, and so now Martha was taking her. I mean, not that Ernest himself had anything to do with it, of course, but even after he divorced Pauline, he still valued her as a writer, as an editor, and complained to his editor at Scribner's, Maxwell Perkins, said he was working on For Whom the Bell Tolls and was concerned about it and needed a good edit on it, and said, I really would like for Pauline to read it, but she hates me so much now that she won't even speak to me, much less read my book. Well, Pauline didn't hate him. She loved him until the day she died, actually. But he didn't really have too much pleasant to say about Pauline, other than that she was a good editor, and he could never deny that. But probably next to Pauline, the person that had the greatest influence on Hemingway was Pauline's Uncle Gus. And Uncle Gus was one of the brothers that Adam mentioned that farmed Pfeiffer Pharmaceuticals, which eventually became Warner Lambert, and then it was bought out by Pfizer Chemicals. So you can imagine, I mean, it was a pretty big operation. They had plants all over the world. And Pauline was Gus's favorite niece. So when she married Ernest Hemingway, Ernest became very special to him as well. So Gus Pfeiffer rented their apartment for them in Paris when they first got married. He purchased their first car for them, and their second car, and their third car. He bought their house for them in Key West, constantly sent them financial gifts, but probably most importantly, in 1933, he gave Ernest $25,000 for his African safari. Now, can you imagine, this was during the Depression, and to just hand him $25,000 to go on safari was really incredible. But out of that safari came Green Hills of Africa and short stories such as Snows of Kilimanjaro and the Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber and other stories. And so Gus was really a major, major influence on Hemingway. Even when Hemingway got ready to write his book on bullfighting, which became the book Death in the Afternoon, Uncle Gus simply wrote to his plant manager in Spain and said, go all over Spain and round up every book that's ever been written on bullfighting and send it to my nephew, Ernest Hemingway, and send me the bill. So this was pretty typical of Gus all throughout Ernest's marriage to his niece. The other person that was influential in her own way was Virginia Pfeiffer, who was Pauline's sister. And it's pretty well documented by all the biographers that when he first met the Pfeiffer sisters at a party in Paris, he really liked Virginia better than Pauline and thought she was much prettier than Pauline. And most of his biographers say that they always thought that there was something very special between Virginia and Ernest, and that they suspected that had she not been a lesbian, that they probably would have thought that they were having an affair. Well, I maintain, and I think there's enough evidence that supports the fact that he did have an affair with Virginia prior to his relationship with Pauline. I think one of the reasons that he had an affair with Virginia had to do with the fact that she had a very wealthy Uncle Gus. And Hadley, they were living off of his first wife Hadley's trust fund, which was dwindling rapidly. And Virginia and Pauline both had major trust funds from their Uncle Gus and from their father. So he took up with Virginia. And whatever happened between Ernest and Virginia apparently came to an end within a few months, because Virginia decided to go back to New York and go back to meet her female friend, Clara Dunn. And it's interesting that Ernest used to always say that he wrote two kinds of stories. He wrote some stories that were totally made up, and he wrote some stories that were absolutely true. And it was his goal as a writer to write so well that people would not be able to tell the difference between which ones were made up and which ones were true. And he would always cite as an example of a story that was completely made up, a short story called The Sea Change. Have any of you ever read The Sea Change? Well, this is interesting, because in The Sea Change, it's a story about a man and a woman, and they're meeting in a bar, and they're having this conversation because the woman is meeting him in the bar to tell him goodbye. They've had a great time over the summer. It's now fall, and she's going back to New York to be with her female lover. And the man is all upset, partly because she's leaving him, but mostly because she's leaving him for a woman. So, of course, he says this is totally made up, but it sure sounds to me a lot like his relationship with Virginia. And during the whole time that he was married to Virginia's sister Pauline, they always did have a very special bond. And I believe it was really, I think a lot of Hemingway's preoccupation with sexual orientation, with gender reversal, with with all kinds of issues related to gender identity and so forth. I really think a lot of that comes from his efforts to try to figure out Virginia, and the fact that she was the woman probably that he could never have. And then there's Pauline's mother and father, Paul and Mary Pfeiffer. And Mary was really probably more of a mother to Ernest than his own mother. He didn't get along well with his mother. His mother hated his writing. She wrote him a letter and said, "You have after one of his first books came out, she wrote him a letter and said, "You have totally disgraced the family with this filth that you're writing." And said that she wasn't going to be able to go out and hold her head up in Oak Park, there where they lived, that she was so embarrassed. Mary Pfeiffer, on the other hand, this sweet little Catholic woman, very religious, she always knew how to handle Ernest and how to give him the moral support that he needed. And he really needed a lot of moral support, because Ernest Hemingway was really very, very insecure. And rather than kind of approaching it like like Ernest's own mother, what Mary would do, she'd read a book of Ernest, and she would write to him and say, "Ernest, I've just finished your book, and I just think you are such a marvelous writer. I can't say that I always care for your subject matter, but but she was always very tactful with Ernest. And so really he relied on her a lot. And if you've ever read any letters between the two of them, it's really, there's a totally different Ernest Hemingway in his letters to his mother-in-law than you see in any other letters to anyone else. It's a very deferential Ernest Hemingway. He also had a lot of respect for his father-in-law. They weren't really that close. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that during the first year that Ernest and Pauline were married, his own father committed suicide. And I think that he really could not bring himself to refer to anyone else as his father. And so it's kind of interesting because if you read his letters to the Pfeiffers, they're usually something like, "Dear Mother Pfeiffer and Pauline's father." You know, I mean, he made a real distinction there. But he did respect him and his business abilities, and was, I think, maybe a little bit intimidated by his father-in-law. So, again, I maintain that without this family, Ernest Hemingway would not have had the financial resources to do the kind of research that went into his books. Certainly wouldn't have the moral support, wouldn't have the editing support, and so forth. So I did write a book called Unbelievable Happiness and Final Sorrow. And this book is based on really two primary sources of information. One of the sources is oral histories that I conducted with people that knew Hemingway or knew the Pfeiffers. And I have to say this book was about 15 years in the making because I was trying to do it in between all of the other things that I was doing. But I'm so glad that one of the first things I did was these oral history interviews. And either 26 or 28 interviews, and out of those 26 or 28 interviews, I counted up the other day, and 14 of those people are now deceased. So had I not interviewed them at the time, their stories really would have been lost. And I was able to interview all three of Ernest Hemingway's sons. Since then, two of them have passed away. I was able to interview his sister-in-law, Matilda Pfeiffer, who was married to Pauline's brother, Carl. I was able to interview Laura Huxley, who was married to Aldous Huxley, but Laura was also Virginia Pfeiffer's female companion, and I won't get into this, but they had some sort of a threesome between Virginia and Laura and Aldous Huxley, and they all three lived together in Hollywood. And I interviewed Laura, and that was a real experience. She lives right under the Hollywood sign. If you go out on her patio, you look up and there's the Hollywood sign, and it was kind of like being on a movie set. But anyway, all of these people that had firsthand knowledge, as well as two of the maids that were living in the household at the time that Ernest Hemingway was visiting in Piggott. So was very fortunate to capture all of these. The other thing that is the primary source for the book is the letters back and forth between Hemingway and the Pfeiffers, between Hemingway and all of his friends, and he was friends with John Dos Passos, with F. Scott Fitzgerald, with Waldo Pierce, with Gertrude Stein, all of these expatriate writers that were in Paris at the time. And they were writing back and forth, and of course, they would mention what was going on in their personal life as well. So this was a really fun part of the research, because it's not like the letters are in one place and here's the letters and go through them. They were scattered all over the country. There are a lot of letters between Hemingway and the Pfeiffers at the Kennedy Library in Boston, a lot of letters at the Princeton University Library, some at Stanford, some in private collections. Of course, I had to go to the archives wherever all of his writers' friends' papers were. So it was really like working a jigsaw puzzle, the only difference being that at least when you work a jigsaw puzzle, you know if it's 500 pieces or 1,000 pieces or whatever. With this, I don't know how many pieces there are. I'm sure there are lots and lots. still out there, because I'm still finding pieces every day since the book has been published. And some interesting things that came up. One of the things that early on I made a trip to Cuba because I was trying to go to all the Hemingway sites. And the people in Cuba asked me, at the time they knew more about Hemingway and Piggott than I did because, at the beginning of my research, because they asked me, they said, now when that barn burned, caught fire in Piggott, what did Hemingway lose in the fire? And I said, well, gee, I don't know. And so when I was doing my research, I was in Pulaski, Michigan. His nephew, Ernest Mainland, who is named for his uncle Ernest, told me that I could come up and read his paper, read Ernest Hemingway's letters to his mother and his grandmother. And so I went up there and I was sitting, the letters were in a bank vault, and I was sitting in the bank vault reading these letters. And I came across one, and it was postmarked Piggott, and it said, "Dear Mother, Sonny, and Ernest, I'm sorry that I haven't written, but all hell is broken loose in Piggott, and the barn caught fire, and I lost all my guns that I bought in St. Louis for hunting, and I lost all my hunting clothes, and I had to throw a bunch of manuscripts out the window, and I lost," and it goes into what he lost. And so it was really an exciting find for me. So the book was, as I said, a long time in the making. It is called Unbelievable Happiness and Final Sorrow, which sounds like a bit of an unwieldy title, but this is a direct quote from Ernest Hemingway, because, as I mentioned, he did not always say great things about Pauline. And if you've read the first edition, and there's now been a revised or a restored edition, but if you've read the first edition of A Movable Feast, he doesn't say very nice things about Pauline in A Movable Feast. He never calls her by name, but he says he wished he had died before the rich ever came into his life and made him go soft as a writer and took him away from his first wife, Hadley, and all this. And so out in the margins that didn't get published in that first book, but written out in the margins of the manuscript that's at the Kennedy Library, he wrote, "I know that I'm being harsh on Pauline in this book, but I'm saving the parts with Pauline for another book, and when I write that book, it will be filled with, among other things, unbelievable happiness and final sorrow." So he never wrote that book. He committed suicide in 1961. Pauline died in 1951, 10 years earlier. So neither one of them ever wrote a book about their relationship, and so my hope is that through this book, maybe I have captured some of what that relationship was about.